I work with industrial equipment maintenance, and at the beginning of last year I had to travel alone to a small town in rural Nevada called Ely. It was supposed to be a quick trip, maybe 2 days at most, because a company hired us to fix a problem with some old refrigeration machines that were failing. I left Salt Lake City right after lunch and drove alone. Anyone who has driven through that region knows how empty those highways are. There are huge stretches with practically nothing besides desert, a few isolated gas stations, and small towns lost in the middle of nowhere. I had done similar trips before, so I wasn't worried. The problem was that I arrived much later than expected because strong winds started hitting the highway, and I had to slow down a lot. By the time I finally got to Ely, it was probably close to 10 at night. I was exhausted, my back hurt from driving for so many hours, and all I wanted was to take a shower and sleep. The hotel the company booked was one of those old roadside motels. 2 floors, doors facing the parking lot, a neon sign that was half failing, and a small office in the front. It didn't look abandoned, but it also didn't look very busy. There were only 4 or 5 pickup trucks scattered across the entire parking lot. When I walked into the reception area, I noticed that smell of old carpet mixed with cheap cleaning products. The woman at the front desk looked extremely tired. She was probably around 60 years old, spoke quietly, and barely looked at me while checking me in. She handed me a key card and casually mentioned that the hotel had been pretty empty that week. Honestly, I thought that sounded great at the time. I just wanted silence. My room was on the 2nd floor, almost at the end of the outside hallway. As soon as I opened the door, I felt that stale air typical of a room that had been closed for too long. I immediately turned on the air conditioner because the room was way too hot and dry. The place looked frozen in time. Dark furniture, an old TV mounted on a metal frame, a yellowish lamp, and carpet that had clearly seen better days. Still, it didn't seem disgusting, just old. I left my suitcase beside the bed, took a quick shower, and stayed on my phone trying to answer a few work messages. The signal there was terrible. The hotel internet kept disconnecting constantly. I remember it was already past midnight when I finally turned off the lights. The parking lot was almost completely silent. Every once in a while I could hear the distant sound of a truck passing on the highway, but besides that there was nothing. No voices, no doors slamming, no people walking around, and that started bothering me more than it should have, because hotels always have some kind of noise. People arriving late, TVs on in other rooms, water running through pipes. That place felt completely dead. I was almost asleep when I heard a sharp click coming from the room door. It was a very specific sound, exactly like someone trying to use a key card on the lock. My entire body froze instantly. I stayed motionless, staring at the door in the dark, while the air conditioner made that constant humming sound behind me. A few seconds later, I heard the doorknob slowly move, not aggressively, not like someone trying to break in. It sounded more like someone trying to enter quietly. Immediately, I sat up in bed and turned on the lamp. The moment the light came on, the sound at the doorknob stopped instantly. The silence became so complete that I could hear the air conditioner vibrating inside the wall. I kept staring at the door, waiting to hear footsteps walking away or someone talking in the hallway, but I heard absolutely nothing. I grabbed my phone to check the time, and it was 1:17 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I thought about how many hours were still left before sunrise. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another guest had mistaken the room number. That happens, especially in old hotels like that one. Even so, there was something strange about the way the doorknob moved. It was too slow, too careful. It didn't feel like someone drunk or confused. It felt like someone trying to enter without drawing attention. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to walk over to the door. Honestly, I don't even know why I did that, because now I think it would have been smarter to stay quiet. I looked through the peephole and nobody was in the hallway. The parking lot downstairs still looked practically empty. The outside light flickered every few seconds and gave everything a strange appearance. I opened the door just a few inches and stuck my head outside. The outside hallway was completely empty. No footsteps, no doors closing, nothing. And the strangest part was that the room next to mine looked completely dark too. I went back inside, already feeling that bad sensation in my stomach that happens when something feels wrong, but you're still trying to convince yourself you're exaggerating. It took me a long time to fall asleep again. I kept the TV on low volume just to have some noise inside the room because the silence in that place was starting to make me nervous. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but I woke up again a few hours later feeling cold. The air conditioner had made the room freezing. The first thing I noticed was that the TV was off, even though I was sure I had left it on. At first I thought maybe I had turned it off before sleeping and just didn't remember, but when I sat up in bed I immediately felt that strange sensation, that something inside the room was different. I can't really explain it. It just felt off. I checked my phone and saw it was almost 4 in the morning. The blue light from the screen illuminated part of the room, and that was when I noticed my suitcase sitting a few inches farther away from the wall. It sounds stupid saying it now, but I always place my suitcase exactly beside the small table because I hate tripping over it during the night. Now it was crooked, closer to the foot of the bed. My sleep vanished instantly. I got up quickly to check it. The main zipper was closed, but the smaller front pocket was slightly open. Just barely, maybe an inch or two. My heart started beating hard because I clearly remembered closing that pocket before going to sleep. I stared around the room trying to figure out if I was forgetting things or if someone had actually entered while I was asleep. I immediately started checking my belongings. Wallet, laptop, charger, company documents, and everything was still there. That should have calmed me down, but it actually made me even more uncomfortable. Because if someone really had entered the room, then it wasn't about theft. And that idea scared me much more. I grabbed the desk chair and jammed it against the doorknob, like those things people do in movies that seem exaggerated until you actually need to do it. After that, I sat on the bed trying to hear any movement coming from the hallway. The problem was that the hotel felt completely empty. The silence was so heavy that every small sound stood out. At one point, I started hearing a very faint noise coming from the wall of the room next door. It wasn't a TV. It sounded like someone walking slowly. The carpet muffled almost everything, but I could hear slight creaks in the floor and a soft sound of something brushing against the wall. I stared in that direction for several minutes without moving. The strange thing was that when I arrived at the hotel, I had noticed there were practically no cars parked near that wing. And I never heard anyone entering the room next door at any point during the night. No door opening, no voices, no television, nothing. And yet now there was clearly someone in there. At one point I heard a metallic click very similar to the sound from my door earlier, except this time it came from the wall next to me, like someone was handling a lock. I couldn't sleep anymore after that. I stayed awake until it started getting light outside. When the sun finally began rising behind the mountains, the parking lot gained a little movement. I saw a large truck pull in near the reception office, and for some reason that relieved me, because the place finally felt inhabited by normal people again. Around 6:30 in the morning, I left the room without even having breakfast. The chair was still jammed against the doorknob, and I remember my hands sweating while unlocking the door. The outside hallway was empty again, and the room next to mine was still closed. The curtains were completely shut. I slowly walked past the door, and the first thing I noticed was that there was no housekeeping card or any sign of occupancy. No coffee cup, no used towels, nothing. But when I got close, I noticed a faint cigarette smell coming from inside. Not a strong, fresh smell, more like the stale odor that stays trapped in a closed room. I went straight down to the reception desk, and the same woman from the night before was still there, now drinking coffee from a plastic cup. I casually asked if the hotel had filled up during the night, because I heard someone in the room next to mine. She looked at the computer screen for a few seconds and said something I still remember exactly the way she said it. There shouldn't be anyone in that room. The calm way she said it instantly made me uncomfortable. At first I thought maybe she misunderstood the room number, so I explained exactly which room was mine and which one was next door. She looked at the monitor again, pressed a few keys, and stayed silent for several seconds. Then she said that room had been blocked in the system because the bathroom needed maintenance. So I asked if any employee had entered during the night, and she replied that nobody besides her had been working since midnight. That genuinely started making me nervous because she said everything so casually, as if she didn't realize how strange it sounded. I briefly told her someone had tried to open my door during the night and mentioned the suitcase being moved. She didn't seem surprised. That was one of the things that stayed in my head the most afterward. She just asked if anything had been stolen. When I said no, she shrugged and said something like, "Sometimes guests confuse the rooms." But she herself had just said nobody was staying next door. I remember feeling that strange cold sensation in my stomach because it felt like she noticed the contradiction, but simply didn't want to continue the conversation. While I was talking to her, I heard a metallic noise coming from the hallway behind the reception office, like a door closing. The woman quickly glanced in that direction and then looked back at the computer screen. It was a very fast reaction, but enough for me to realize someone else was inside the hotel. I asked if there was another employee there, and she answered, "The manager showed up earlier." That was all. No further explanation. At that point, I started feeling like I was bothering her by bringing up the subject. I left the reception area trying to act normal, but I decided to return to the room to grab my things before heading to work. I didn't want to leave my laptop and equipment there after that night. As I climbed the outside stairs, I saw a man standing at the end of the hallway near the ice machine. He was wearing a heavy dark jacket even though it was warm outside, and was partially turned away from me. The first thing I noticed was that he had a huge ring of keys hanging from his belt. Not keycards, actual metal keys. He stayed motionless while I walked down the hallway. When I got closer, he quickly turned his face toward me. He was probably in his 50s, had an unshaven beard, and wore a strange expression, like someone caught doing something he shouldn't. I said good morning out of politeness, but he didn't answer. He just stared at me as I walked past. I swear I felt that kind of tension you feel when crossing paths with someone obviously disturbed. I entered my room and started packing everything quickly into my suitcase. My heart jumped when I heard footsteps stop right outside the door a few seconds later. No knocking, no voice. Just footsteps stopping directly in front of my room. I froze, holding the suitcase zipper while watching the shadow of feet appear beneath the door. The person stood there for way too long, maybe 20 or 30 seconds, long enough for me to realize it wasn't normal. Then I heard a faint metallic sound, very similar to keys moving against each other. At that moment, I completely froze. My first thought was that the guy was the manager and maybe he was checking something in the room. But then I realized he hadn't knocked, hadn't said anything, and also hadn't tried to enter. He was just standing there. The silence became so strange that I could hear my own breathing inside the room. A few seconds later, I heard the keys clink together again, followed by a very soft click at the doorknob. Exactly like the sound from the night before, that was the moment it finally clicked in my head. The person outside was probably the same one who had tried to enter earlier. My entire body went into full alert. I stared at the door, waiting for it to open. The chair I had wedged against the doorknob was still there, and I remember thinking that maybe it was the only thing preventing someone from entering at that exact moment. The man moved the doorknob once more, this time a little harder, and then everything went silent again. A few seconds later, I heard the footsteps slowly walking away down the hallway. I waited almost a full minute before approaching the door. When I finally looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty again. But on the floor, right near my door, there was a small folded white card. My stomach instantly dropped because I was absolutely sure it hadn't been there before. I opened the door just enough to grab the card and quickly stepped back inside. It was one of those simple, thick paper cards used for writing Wi-Fi passwords or room numbers, but there was nothing written on the front. When I turned it over, there was only one sentence written in blue pen: "You should keep the door locked." To this day, I remember the physical sensation I felt reading that. My hands immediately started shaking, because it didn't sound like a normal warning. It sounded like someone making it clear they had already gotten inside before. I grabbed my things as fast as possible and went straight to the reception office, determined to leave. But when I got there, the woman wasn't behind the desk anymore. The office was empty. I called out a few times and nobody answered. That was when I heard quiet voices coming from a back room. One sounded like the receptionist. The other was male. I couldn't understand exactly what they were saying, but I clearly heard my room number mentioned. I stood there for a few seconds, unsure what to do. And that was when I heard the male voice say in a low, irritated tone, he wasn't supposed to wake up. At that moment, I felt the kind of fear that makes your entire body feel weightless. Like your brain realizes danger before you can even think clearly. I didn't stay to hear anything else. I grabbed my suitcase and walked straight toward the exit, trying to make as little noise as possible. As I crossed the parking lot, I had the strong feeling someone was watching me through the office windows. I got into the car so quickly I almost dropped my keys. The moment I started the engine, I automatically looked toward the second-floor hallway where my room was. And the man I had seen near the ice machine was standing up there now, directly in front of my room door. He was staring at me. He didn't look surprised that I was leaving. He didn't look confused. He just stood there staring straight at me without moving. The strangest part was that he was holding something long in his right hand. At that distance, I couldn't tell whether it was a tool, flashlight, or something else. I only remember how motionless he looked. I reversed out immediately and left the parking lot without thinking. My heart was racing so hard that my hands shook on the steering wheel. For the first several minutes on the highway, I kept checking the rearview mirror because I was convinced that man might come after me. I only started breathing a little easier once I reached the industrial area where I needed to work. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself maybe there was some normal explanation for everything. Maybe it was just a weird employee trying to scare guests. Maybe the card was some stupid prank. Maybe I was too exhausted and interpreting everything worse than it really was. But none of those explanations completely fit. The worst part happened later that afternoon. When I finished the job, the company asked if I needed another night at the hotel because the work might continue the next day. I made up an excuse and told them I'd rather drive to Elko to sleep there. On the way, I stopped at a gas station and decided to look up reviews for that hotel on my phone. Until then, I hadn't even thought about doing that. The signal there was finally good, and I started reading comments. Most people only complained that the place was old or poorly maintained, but after a few minutes I found 2 older reviews that made my blood run cold. One of them said someone entered the room during the night while the guest was sleeping, but nothing had been stolen. The other mentioned an employee who kept walking around occupied rooms during the night with a master key. And there was one specific detail that genuinely disturbed me. The person said they found objects slightly moved around the room the next morning, exactly like what happened to me. I sat there staring at the phone screen inside my car for several minutes with that horrible feeling in my chest, because it meant it probably wasn't the first time, and honestly, maybe it wasn't even the worst one. To this day, I still think about why they entered the rooms without stealing anything. I've never managed to come up with an explanation that makes me feel any better. After that trip, I've never been able to sleep properly in roadside hotels again. Every time I hear someone touching a doorknob in a hallway during the middle of the night, my body goes right back to that night in Nevada. Story 2. I was 29 years old when this happened to me in Columbus, Ohio. I lived alone in a small apartment. Nothing luxurious. It was one of those newer buildings near downtown, full of young people who work all day and barely ever talk to each other. I worked in the administrative department of a dental clinic, and my routine back then was extremely repetitive. I woke up early, stopped by the gym before work, spent the entire day stuck in an office, and then came home exhausted. I had ended a relationship a few months earlier, and honestly, I was in that phase of trying to distract myself and move on. My friends kept insisting that I should download dating apps again, even though I wasn't very excited about it. I ended up downloading one more out of boredom than anything else, and that's where I met a guy named Ryan. His profile seemed completely normal. It didn't have those exaggerated gym photos or weird poses. They were ordinary pictures. One of him fishing, another at a baseball game, and a few in coffee shops or hiking trails. He said he was 34 and worked with home insurance. The conversation started extremely naturally. Nothing invasive, nothing strange. He replied quickly, asked normal questions, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. After a few days of talking, I started finding it strange how perfectly adjusted he seemed. Like he always knew exactly what to say. But at the time, it just seemed like maturity. What caught my attention the most at first was how much attention he paid to little details I mentioned. If I said I was tired because of the gym, he would later ask how my workout went. If I mentioned an annoying client at work, he would remember it days later. It sounds silly, but after talking to so many superficial people on dating apps, that ended up giving me a sense of safety. And honestly, he was attractive in a very ordinary way. Not the kind of guy who looks too perfect and fake. He seemed real. We started talking practically all day long, during lunch, before bed, when I got off work. And one thing I clearly remember is that he never pushed to meet quickly. That actually made me comfortable, because usually men on dating apps try to speed everything up immediately. He didn't. He seemed patient, polite. But after about 4 or 5 days, little coincidences started happening that give me chills now when I think about them. The first was when I casually mentioned I was leaving the gym. He replied, "Funny, I think I've seen you there once." I thought that was normal because the gym was relatively popular in that area. I jokingly answered that it probably wasn't me because I always wore a cap and huge headphones. Then he described the exact black cap I usually wore. At the time, I still rationalized it. After all, one of my dating profile pictures showed the cap in a mirror selfie, so it didn't seem that strange. At least not at that moment. Over the next few days, small comments started appearing that made me uncomfortable for a few seconds, but never enough for me to think something was really wrong. One afternoon, I mentioned that I needed to stop by the grocery store after work because my fridge was practically empty. About 20 minutes later, he replied saying, "Don't go to that Kroger near the main avenue right now, it's always packed at this hour." The problem was that I had never told him which grocery store I went to. I actually stopped and stared at the message, trying to remember if I had mentioned it before without realizing. Since we had been talking for several days already, I figured maybe I had casually mentioned it at some point and forgotten. Even so, it stayed stuck in my head. Later, while I pushed my cart through the grocery store, I started noticing every person around me for absolutely no reason. It's strange how your brain changes when something feels slightly wrong. You start noticing people staring too long, cars parked near the entrance, details you would normally ignore. That night, while we were talking, I jokingly asked if he had hired a private investigator to follow me. He replied with a laughing emoji and wrote, "Columbus is smaller than it seems." At the time, that just sounded like a casual response. Now I see it differently. Another thing that started bothering me was the absurd frequency of the coincidences. I would mention buying coffee, and he would say he knew the exact coffee shop. I would mention a small restaurant where I sometimes had lunch, and he'd say he had passed by there a lot. In theory, none of that was impossible because we lived in the same city. The problem was the growing sensation that he was always one step ahead in conversations, as if he knew things before I even properly mentioned them. And still, I kept rationalizing everything because he never did anything openly frightening. He never sent aggressive messages, never pressured me to meet, never sexualized conversations like most guys on dating apps. On the contrary, he seemed extremely controlled. And looking back now, maybe that was the worst part. One Thursday night, I was finishing my workout when I got a message from him saying, "Do you always leave the gym this late?" My entire body went cold instantly, because I had never mentioned my schedule. I stood there staring at my phone screen while the sounds of treadmills and weights continued around me. I replied asking how he knew I was still there. It took him about 2 minutes to answer. Then he wrote, "Just guessed because you take longer to reply after 8. Right after that, he sent another laughing emoji, as if I were overreacting, and once again I tried convincing myself that it made sense. But that night, for the first time, I waited inside the gym until other people left before walking to the parking lot alone. That night, I watched the entire parking lot before getting into my car. It felt ridiculous acting that way because of dating app messages, but I simply couldn't ignore the strange feeling growing inside me. The gym parking lot was large and partially dark because some lights near the back were burned out. I remember pressing my key fob several times just to locate my car faster. As I walked, I started noticing the cars still running around the lot, something I normally would never do. There was a dark sedan parked near the exit with its headlights off, but the engine seemed to be running because I could see a little smoke coming from behind it because of the cold weather. I glanced at it quickly without trying to look nervous. I couldn't clearly see who was inside because the windows were too dark. I got into my car and locked the doors immediately. Before leaving, I grabbed my phone and reread the entire conversation with Ryan, trying to find some moment where I might have revealed more information than I remembered. And honestly, maybe I had. When you talk a lot with someone, you automatically start mentioning little things. Places, schedules, routines. But that still didn't explain the specific feeling of being watched. As I drove out of the parking lot, I quickly looked in the rearview mirror and saw the dark sedan pulling out of its spot a few seconds later. My heart sped up immediately, but I tried not to become paranoid. After all, dozens of people were leaving the gym at that hour. Over the next 2 days, I started replying less to his messages. Not abruptly, but trying to create a little distance because my intuition was bothering me too much. The strange thing was that he noticed immediately. He asked if something had happened, if I was stressed at work, if he had done something wrong. And he asked in such a calm, polite way that it ended up making me feel guilty for suspecting him. That's a difficult thing to explain, because nothing individually seemed serious enough to justify real fear. It was always a strange comment followed by a plausible explanation. But altogether, it started becoming psychologically exhausting. On Friday of that same week, the first thing happened that truly scared me. I was at work near the end of my shift when I received a message from him saying, "You should leave earlier today. Looks like it's going to rain hard." I stared at that for a few seconds because I had never told him where I worked. Not the neighborhood, not the building, nothing. And on that specific day, the forecast really did show heavy rain coming. I replied asking how he knew my schedule. He took longer than usual to respond. Then he wrote only, You mentioned it once. I was almost certain I hadn't. And that was exactly the moment I started feeling real fear, not discomfort. Actual fear. I tried continuing my work normally, but after that message, I kept staring out the clinic windows constantly. Our office was on the third floor of a commercial building that stayed relatively busy during the day, but after 6 p.m., the area became much emptier. The rain started near the end of my shift, exactly like he had said. First light, then heavier, hitting hard against the office windows. Some people left early because of the weather, including my supervisor. I normally stayed until around 6:30 organizing documents and closing reports for the day. But that night I decided to leave earlier. I can't really explain why. It was just that persistent feeling that I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my things quickly and went down the nearly empty elevator. As the doors opened in the lobby, I remember feeling that immediate cold sensation in my stomach for no clear reason. The lobby was way too quiet. The building security guard wasn't at the front desk at that moment, probably in the bathroom or somewhere else. Outside, the rain distorted everything through the glass. That was when I saw the car. A dark sedan parked directly across the street, partially hidden behind a tree soaked by the rain. The engine was running, and there was someone sitting in the driver's seat, staring directly at the building entrance. My entire body froze instantly because I recognized the face immediately. It was Ryan. We had never met in person before. We hadn't even video called yet. But it was him. The same pictures from the app. The same face, the same short beard. He was sitting inside the car, completely motionless, staring fixedly at the building entrance like he was waiting for someone to come out, or waiting specifically for me. And the worst part was that I had never told him where I worked, never sent my location, never taken pictures in front of the building, nothing. I remember the overwhelming rush of adrenaline hitting so fast that my hands started tingling. I don't think he had seen me yet at that moment because I had stopped immediately after stepping out of the elevator, still behind the lobby's glass doors. I stood there watching him for a few seconds, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to believe it was some impossible coincidence and that he was waiting for someone else. But deep down, I already knew it wasn't. While I stood there, I saw him grab his phone. Seconds later, my phone vibrated inside my purse. I didn't even need to look to know it was a message from him. Still, I slowly took my phone out. The message simply said, "You left early today." And at that exact moment, he lifted his eyes directly toward the entrance and saw me standing there behind the glass. The second his eyes met mine, I felt my entire body go cold in a way I had never experienced before. It wasn't ordinary shock. It was that immediate sensation of real danger. He didn't look surprised that I was standing there looking at him. Actually, what scared me most was the exact opposite. He kept staring at me as if everything were completely normal, as if we had somehow already planned that meeting. Rain ran down the windshield while he held his phone in one hand. My phone vibrated again. I couldn't even open the message. I automatically stepped backward, almost tripping over a chair in the lobby. My heart was beating so hard that I started hearing that muffled sound inside my ears. That was when he smiled slightly. Not an exaggerated or horror movie smile. It was worse precisely because it looked too normal. A small smile, like someone finally seeing the person they had been waiting for. Then he opened the car door. Immediately, I hurried through the lobby looking for the security guard. I found him coming from the hallway near the bathrooms, and I started talking so fast that I think he barely understood half of what I said. I only remember pointing toward the street saying that a man was following me. When the security guard looked outside, Ryan was already crossing the street toward the building in the rain. The guard immediately locked the front glass doors and asked if I knew that man. I said I had only talked to him through an app and had never told him where I worked. Ryan stopped on the sidewalk outside, staring directly at the entrance. Even through the rain, you could tell he remained extremely calm. That was what terrified me most. He didn't seem nervous. He didn't seem desperate. He just stood there watching. My phone kept vibrating nonstop inside my purse. At some point, the security guard asked if I wanted him to call the police. And honestly, until that moment, part of me still thought maybe I was overreacting. Because technically, he hadn't done anything illegal yet. He was just standing outside. But then something happened that destroyed any doubt I still had. The guard asked for my name to register the building incident. The moment I said Emily, Ryan slightly lifted his head outside like he had heard through the glass. And immediately my phone received another message. This time I opened it. It said, "You're even prettier in person, Emily." The problem was that my name on the app wasn't Emily. I used my nickname Emma, and I had never told him my full name. At that moment, I started shaking for real, not mild nervousness. My entire body was going into panic. The security guard took the phone from my hand to read the message and immediately changed his expression. I think until then he had also been trying to treat everything like some misunderstanding, but you could tell he instantly understood that something was seriously wrong. He asked me to go to a small room behind the reception desk while he called the police. Before leaving the lobby, I looked one more time toward the street. Ryan was still standing in the exact same spot under the rain, staring fixedly at the building entrance. The most disturbing thing was how patient he looked, like someone who believed that eventually I would come out. I sat in that room listening to the rain hitting the windows while trying to control my breathing. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Within minutes, he had sent several messages in a row, some asking why I was scared, others saying he just wanted to talk in person, and one of them still bothers me to this day. He wrote, "I've known you worked here since last week. You should have been honest with me too." That destroyed me because it made it clear how long he had been watching me without my knowledge. I immediately started thinking about every time I had left work alone, every night walking through the gym parking lot, every occasion where maybe he had been nearby without me realizing it. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, but when the officers went outside to talk to him, the car was already gone. That made everything worse because it left me with the horrible feeling that he could appear anywhere again. I showed them all the messages, the dating profile, and explained everything from the beginning. One of the officers asked if I had shared my address, workplace, or routine with him, and that was when I realized how small scattered pieces of information can reveal your entire life to someone attentive enough. Comments about traffic, the gym, coffee shops, lunch schedules, grocery stores. Little by little, a person can figure out exactly where you live and where you go. That night, a friend slept over with me because I simply couldn't stay alone in the apartment. I spent hours staring through the living room window every time I heard a car slowing down outside. The next day, I discovered his profile had completely disappeared from the app. Number disconnected, pictures deleted, everything gone. The police never found anything concrete because technically he barely left any traces, but I never managed to forget the way he stared at the building entrance that night, as if he had already known me long before we ever started talking. After that, I changed gyms, altered my entire routine, and stopped using dating apps for a long time. Because the worst part wasn't discovering that he knew where I worked. It was realizing that he had probably been watching me long before I even knew he existed. Story 3. I'm 38 years old and I work in construction in Springfield, Missouri. Over the last few years, I started saving money because I wanted to leave the city and buy a more isolated piece of land to build a small house someday. Nothing extravagant. I've always liked more remote places, especially after spending almost all my time surrounded by traffic, noise, and construction sites. So I started looking for cheaper rural properties in smaller towns nearby. A realtor showed me a relatively large property almost an hour and a half away, near a rural area between Hartville and Lebanon. The price was far below normal because, according to him, the owner needed to sell quickly after a family inheritance dispute. At the time, that didn't seem very strange to me. It happens all the time with old properties. The realtor said he wouldn't be able to go with me that day because he was showing another property, so he simply sent me the location and said I could visit alone without any problem. The place was literally at the end of a dead-end dirt road. The farther I drove in that direction, the fewer houses I saw. At one point, the GPS even lost signal for several minutes. It was early November, late afternoon, completely gray skies and that damp cold typical of Missouri before winter gets worse. I remember thinking maybe I had left too late to make that visit because it was already getting dark between the trees. The dirt road was narrow and full of deep old tire marks. It looked more like a path used by pickup trucks and tractors than regular cars. In several places, the trees were so close that the branches almost scraped the sides of the truck. There were no lights at all, no poles, no proper fences, just woods, open land, and silence. The kind of silence you only find very far from the city. After about 15 minutes driving down that road, I finally reached the entrance to the property. There was an old metal gate partially open, crooked on one side, and a fallen sign on the ground that probably had the property number painted on it years earlier. As soon as I drove the truck inside, the first thing that caught my attention was an old car parked farther ahead near the trees. It was an old sedan, probably from the 90s, dark-colored, covered in dust and dry leaves. From a distance, it looked completely abandoned. Grass was already starting to grow around the tires. My first impression was that someone had left it there years ago. I didn't think it was that strange because rural properties constantly turn into dumping grounds for old cars. Even so, I remember noticing that the car was parked in a strange way. It didn't look randomly abandoned. It was aligned neatly near the edge of the woods, as if someone had parked it there carefully. I turned off the truck and stayed there for a few seconds looking across the property through the window before getting out. The place was bigger than I expected from the pictures. There was a huge open area covered in dry grass and a few scattered trees farther back. There was also an old collapsed structure near one side, maybe a small barn or shed that had almost completely fallen apart. The wind made that constant sound moving through the trees, and every now and then I heard branches cracking somewhere in the woods around me. It didn't necessarily seem like a scary place, just too isolated. I grabbed my phone to take some pictures and immediately realized I had no signal again. That started bothering me a little because if anything happened out there, I'd probably have to drive several minutes before finding reception again. Even so, I started walking across the property trying to imagine where a house could eventually be built. The ground was damp from the rain the night before and my boots sank slightly into the dirt in some places. After a few minutes, I ended up getting closer to the abandoned car out of curiosity. And that was when I started noticing details that didn't match the idea of abandonment. First, the tires weren't completely flat. Old, yes, but still supporting the car. Then I noticed the windows were relatively clean compared to the rest of the body, like someone had recently wiped them with their hand. I stopped beside the driver's side trying to look inside, but the reflection of the trees made it hard to see clearly. When I finally managed to see the inside of the car, I immediately felt that bad sensation in my stomach. There wasn't trash everywhere, old clothes, or the typical signs of a car abandoned for years. The back seat was way too clean. There was only a half-full bottle of water on the passenger side floor and a folded jacket on the back seat. That alone was enough to make me uncomfortable because someone had clearly used that car recently. I tried opening the driver's door more out of instinct than anything else. It was locked, and the moment I pulled the handle, I heard a small electronic sound from inside. Very quiet but clear, like the click of automatic locks engaging. My entire body froze instantly, because that meant the battery still worked. And if the battery still worked, then that car probably hadn't been sitting there for very long. I pulled my hand away immediately and started looking around the property for the first time while actually paying attention. The silence felt different now. Before it had just felt isolated. Now it felt like the kind of silence where you start thinking, maybe someone is watching without making a sound. I stood there for a few seconds listening. The wind still moved through the trees, but besides that there was nothing. No birds, no distant dogs, no road noise. Just that heavy, cold silence around the entire property. Even trying to stay rational, I started feeling that automatic need to get back to my truck. Not because I had seen anything concrete, but because my brain was clearly registering that something was wrong with that place. Still, before leaving, I decided to walk a little farther toward the back of the property because I wanted to at least justify the long drive out there. The problem was that the farther I walked, the more I felt the strange sensation that I was entering somewhere I shouldn't be. The woods around me became denser, and the ground was covered with wet leaves and old tire tracks sunk deep into the mud. In some spots, you could see small clearings opened between the trees, as if vehicles had driven through there before. I also remember noticing relatively fresh footprints near the edge of the woods. I couldn't identify the exact shape because the soil was too wet, but someone had clearly walked there after the rain the night before. That made me even more uncomfortable, because the realtor had talked about the place as if it had been completely empty for months. I kept walking for a few more minutes trying to ignore the bad feeling until I heard a quick sound from the trees behind me. Not loud. It sounded like someone stepping on a dry branch and immediately stopping afterward. I turned around fast thinking maybe it was a deer or some other animal, but I saw nothing except the trees swaying slowly in the wind. That was when I started noticing something specific that still gives me chills when I remember it. Every time I walked a few steps, I heard small sounds appearing farther back in the woods. Not constantly, and always a few seconds after my own footsteps. At first I thought maybe it was just echoes from branches or leaves moving because of the wind. But soon I realized the sounds didn't follow the wind. They followed my rhythm. When I stopped, everything became completely silent. When I started walking again, a few seconds later, another quiet sound would come from deeper behind me between the trees. My heart started racing for real then. I kept trying to rationalize it by telling myself it was probably some animal, moving nervously through the woods. But there was a very specific pattern to it. It felt like something was keeping a constant distance from me. At one point, I stopped completely and stood still for almost 30 seconds. No sound, then I took 3 slow steps. A few seconds later, I clearly heard 3 separate crunches of dry leaves behind me. The same number. The same speed. I felt such a strong chill that my entire body tensed instantly. I turned around quickly again, trying to see between the trees, but the late afternoon darkness was already swallowing everything. All I could see were trunks, branches, and dark sections of woods moving slightly in the cold wind. After that, I decided I had seen enough of that property. The bad feeling had gone beyond the point where I could ignore it. I started walking back toward the truck, trying not to look nervous, although my whole body was already on alert. The problem was that now I noticed every little sound around me. The noise of my boots sinking into the wet ground, the wind hitting the trees, leaves scraping together, and underneath all that, those quiet sounds kept appearing farther behind me, always maintaining a certain distance, never getting too close. That was one of the most disturbing parts. It felt like whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be seen, only to follow my movements. Several times I thought about simply running to the truck, but another part of me was afraid of seeming irrational if it really was just paranoia. So I kept walking quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder. As I got closer to the open area again, I started feeling slight relief when I could finally see my truck parked near the entrance to the property. But that relief disappeared almost immediately when I looked at the ground. My footprints were clearly marked in the wet dirt from the path I had taken earlier, but beside them there was another set of footprints appearing parallel to mine. Fresh footprints, and they definitely hadn't been there before. My brain took a few seconds to process it. I stopped there staring at the ground, trying to understand whether maybe they were older tracks I simply hadn't noticed earlier. But they weren't. The footprints appeared only from a certain point onward and followed exactly beside mine, maintaining practically the same distance for several yards. As if someone had been walking hidden inside the woods, following my steps without fully approaching me. The worst part was that the damp soil made it obvious which tracks were newer. Some still had soft, muddy edges slowly sinking inward. My heart started beating so hard that I could taste that dry, metallic flavor in my mouth. I immediately looked toward the woods beside me, trying to find someone, but I saw absolutely nothing. And that was exactly when I heard the sound behind me, a slow, heavy metallic creak. I turned quickly toward the old car and clearly saw the rear driver's side door finishing closing slowly. Not slamming, just slowly shutting until it clicked into place. I stood completely frozen, staring at it. Because I was absolutely certain no one had been visible near that car seconds earlier. At that moment, my body simply went into automatic mode. I stopped trying to understand anything. I started walking fast toward the truck without taking my eyes off the old car. The wind felt stronger now, shaking the dry branches above me and making that constant sound of leaves scraping together. But underneath it, I swear I could still hear faint footsteps coming from the woods again. My heart was racing so hard that my hands started shaking. When I reached the truck, I shoved the key toward the door so fast that I missed twice before finally unlocking it. The entire time I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone to appear between the trees or beside the old car. But the worst part was precisely not seeing anyone. The car remained parked exactly the same way, partially hidden along the side of the property. The only difference now was that the rear door was fully closed. I got into the truck and locked the doors immediately. As soon as I started the engine, the headlights illuminated part of the open field. And for one very quick second, I thought I saw movement near the trees behind the old sedan. Not a clear image, just something dark moving away between the trunks the instant the light hit that direction. I reversed so fast that the tires slid in the mud and started driving back down the dirt road without thinking about anything except getting out of there. The problem was that the feeling of being followed didn't disappear after I left the property. During the first few minutes driving along the narrow road, I kept constantly checking the rearview mirror. The sky was getting dark quickly, and the trees on both sides created huge shadows across the road. Several times I thought I saw headlights appearing far behind me, but when I looked more carefully, there was nothing there. Part of that was probably pure accumulated panic. Even so, I couldn't relax. I drove much faster than normal until I finally reached a larger paved road. Only then did I start breathing a little easier. I stopped at a gas station about 20 minutes later because my hands were still shaking too badly on the steering wheel. While filling up the tank, I decided to call the realtor directly to ask about the car on the property. At first he sounded confused and said he didn't know about any abandoned vehicle there. When I described the location more clearly, he went silent for a few seconds and asked exactly where the car had been parked. Then he answered in a strange tone that it was probably the old owner's son's car. I asked what he meant by that. And that was when the conversation became much worse than I expected. The realtor started speaking much more quietly than before, like someone carefully choosing his words. He explained that the previous owner of the property had died a few years earlier, and the land became trapped in a complicated inheritance dispute. Up to that point, nothing sounded too strange. The problem was the owner's son. According to the realtor, the guy disappeared after a serious fight involving the sale of the property. Some people around the area believed he still showed up there from time to time because he never accepted losing the land. When I asked whether anyone had seen him recently, the realtor answered too quickly. Not officially. That response immediately gave me chills. I kept pressing because at that point I was genuinely frightened. That was when he casually mentioned that some people who visited the property before didn't feel comfortable there. One of them had supposedly given up on buying it after finding signs that someone was entering the property during the night. I asked why he hadn't told me any of this before sending me there alone. The realtor immediately became defensive, saying it was probably just locals making up stories and that nobody had ever found anything concrete. But you could clearly hear in his voice that there was something he didn't want to talk about further. Before hanging up, I mentioned the footprints and the car door closing. He went completely silent for a few seconds and then answered only, "You didn't go into the woods, did you?" That made me uncomfortable on an entirely different level because the way he asked sounded more worried than curious. After that call, I sat inside the truck at the gas station, trying to decide whether I was becoming paranoid or not. Part of me wanted to believe there was a simple explanation for everything. Maybe someone really was living hidden on that property. Maybe the old owner's son was illegally using the place and trying to scare visitors away to keep buyers from purchasing it. Honestly, that was the most rational explanation. The problem was that the more I remembered the details, the less normal it seemed. Especially the footprints, because they hadn't appeared coming from the road or the open field. They came from the woods, parallel to mine, as if someone had been following me without making direct contact. And the worst part was thinking about how long it had already been happening before I noticed. While driving back to Springfield that night, I kept constantly checking my mirrors. Every dark pickup truck behind me made me nervous. Every dark curve in the road tightened my stomach. I got home late that night completely mentally exhausted, and honestly I thought the fear would fade after sleeping. But the opposite happened. Over the next few days I started researching more about that area, and found old comments on local forums about people avoiding that road after dark. One guy mentioned hearing footsteps following him near the property. Another said he found recent food inside an abandoned car near the woods. After that, I blocked the realtor's number and never again considered buying isolated land in that area. Because even now, I still can't forget the specific feeling I had when I saw those footprints appearing beside mine. It didn't feel like someone had suddenly shown up there. It felt like that person had already been walking with me for a very long time. Story 4. I'm 31 years old and I live alone in a rented house on the outskirts of Des Moines, Iowa. It's not exactly rural, but it's not a busy neighborhood either. It's a more isolated area filled with long streets, old houses, and very little public lighting. I moved there because the rent was cheap and relatively close to the warehouse where I worked at the time. My routine was extremely predictable. I worked early, came home in the late afternoon, made food, watched something in the living room, and went to sleep. I've always liked being alone, so I never had a problem living in a more isolated house. The house itself was old, probably built in the 70s. It had narrow hallways, old carpet in the bedrooms, and those thin walls that make every creak sound louder at night. But besides that, I never had problems there, at least not until the calls started. The first one happened on a Tuesday close to midnight. I was almost asleep when my phone started vibrating on the table beside the bed. Unknown number. I thought it was spam or some automated call and almost ignored it. But I ended up answering because my mom sometimes calls late using her work phone. As soon as I said hello, I heard only faint static on the other end. No voice, no clear breathing, just that empty sound of a connected call. I waited a few seconds thinking maybe the person was having connection issues, but then the call disconnected. At the time, I didn't think it was scary, just annoying. What was strange was the frequency. The next night it happened again at almost the exact same time, and then again the following night. Always an unknown number, always silence. Sometimes I heard small noises on the other side, like distant movement or a faint metallic sound, but never a clear voice. After the fourth call, I stopped answering immediately. I just let it ring until it disconnected on its own. But it started affecting me more than I wanted to admit, because the calls always happened late at night, when the entire house was already silent. And there's something deeply uncomfortable about staring at your vibrating phone in a dark room, knowing someone is listening to you on the other end without saying anything. At one point, I started thinking maybe it was some friend trying to pull a stupid prank. I even asked around at work if anyone had my new number, because I had recently changed SIM cards. Nobody seemed to know anything. A few days later, I finally decided to answer again, just to tell the person to stop. I remember that night exactly because it was raining heavily outside, and the sound of water hitting the windows made the house feel even more closed in. As soon as I answered, I stayed quiet for a few seconds, waiting for the person to speak first. And that was when I clearly heard slow breathing on the other side of the line. Not heavy breathing, just someone breathing slowly very close to the phone. My entire body broke out in chills instantly. I asked who it was about 3 times. Then the call disconnected again. After that night, I started leaving all the lights in the house on later than usual. It sounds exaggerated saying it now, but those calls started changing my routine without me realizing it. I turned the TV volume up higher so I wouldn't hear every small sound coming from the hallway. I checked the doors more times before sleeping. Even the way I walked through the house changed because I became overly aware of floor creaks and plumbing noises. The worst part was that I had no concrete reason to call it a threat. It was just someone calling and staying silent. Even so, there was something deeply wrong about it, especially because the timing was almost always the same. Between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, on a Friday night, after about a week of those calls, the person finally spoke for the first time. I was sitting in the living room watching a recorded game when my phone vibrated on the coffee table. Unknown number again. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. As soon as I put the phone to my ear, I heard silence first. Then a low male voice asked, "Do you always leave the television at that volume?" My entire body froze immediately. It wasn't a distorted or aggressive voice. It sounded like a normal man speaking calmly, and that made everything worse. At first I thought maybe it was some neighbor messing with me, because my TV really was loud at that moment. I answered angrily, asking who he was and how he knew that. The man stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he said something I still remember exactly, that Samsung TV is bigger than I imagined. A cold feeling shot up my spine because he guessed the brand of the TV. And it wasn't something easy to identify from outside, especially at night. My first reaction was to immediately stand up and look around the living room, trying to figure out where someone could possibly be seeing it from. The front curtains were closed. The side of the house faced an empty lot. I kept asking who he was, but the man completely ignored me. Instead, he commented, "You should replace that hallway light, it flickers all the time." At that exact moment, I automatically looked toward the hallway, and the light really had been flickering slightly for weeks. It was a small thing I kept putting off fixing. My heart started beating so hard that it became difficult to think clearly, because that meant one of two things. Either someone had been inside my house at some point, or they were watching from much closer than they should have been. I hung up immediately and checked the entire house right away. Kitchen, bathroom, bedrooms, laundry room, back door, everything locked. Every window closed. Even so, I couldn't shake the horrible feeling that something was wrong inside that house. I grabbed a kitchen knife and spent almost 20 minutes walking through the house like an idiot, searching for someone hidden. Now I know I probably should have called the police right then, but honestly, part of me was still trying to rationalize everything. I was still stuck on the idea that maybe this was some extremely elaborate prank from someone who knew my routine. The problem was that besides a few coworkers, nobody had my new number. And none of them even knew my house. That night I barely slept. Every time I started drifting off, some tiny sound would wake me instantly. The wind brushing branches outside sounded like footsteps. The plumbing creak sounded like doors opening. At one point during the night, I heard something lightly hit the side of the house and I stayed frozen in bed, holding my breath for almost a full minute. I didn't hear anything else afterward, but the feeling of being watched never went away. It was like the entire house had changed after that phone call. Over the next few days, the calls continued. Except now the man spoke a little more each time. never for long, and never directly answering my questions. It was always like he was commenting on things he could see. One night he asked if I had fixed the loose latch on the kitchen door yet. Another time he commented that I should stop leaving my shoes near the couch because someone could trip over them. Every call made my stomach sink worse because every detail was real. Small things, inside the house things, and they weren't details someone could notice just by walking past outside. I started mentally reviewing every person who had entered the house since I moved in. Delivery drivers, maintenance workers, co-workers, but nothing made sense. At some point I started sleeping with a chair wedged under my bedroom doorknob because I simply couldn't relax anymore. I also began checking the windows multiple times before bed. The most disturbing part was the calm tone in his voice. He never yelled, never directly threatened me. He sounded like someone casually discussing my own house. On a Wednesday night, while I was sitting on my bed trying to ignore all of it, the phone rang again. As soon as I answered, the voice quietly said, "You check the hallway every night now?" And at the exact same moment, I heard a creak coming directly from the hallway outside my bedroom. My entire body froze. The hallway in that house was narrow and dark, connected directly to my bedroom, bathroom, and living room. And that creak had definitely come from there. It wasn't from the call. It wasn't from the TV. It was inside the house. I sat there on the bed gripping the phone so tightly my hands started hurting. The man's voice stayed on the line, breathing quietly for a few seconds. Then he calmly asked, "You heard that?" My heart started pounding so hard I felt that strange tingling in my arms. I grabbed the knife I had been keeping beside the bed since the first calls and stared at the bedroom door, waiting to hear another sound. The house seemed silent again, until I heard a faint creak from the hallway carpet. One slow step, then another. My brain immediately tried finding a rational explanation. Old wood, plumbing, anything, but deep down I already knew it wasn't. Then the voice on the phone started laughing very softly. Not a loud laugh. It was worse precisely because it sounded so restrained, almost satisfied. And then the worst part happened. While holding the phone to my ear, I clearly heard the same sound from the call coming from inside the hallway. The same faint connected call static, very close to my bedroom door. I can't properly explain the level of fear I felt in that moment, because until then there had still been psychological distance. It was someone calling, someone outside. At that instant, that distance disappeared completely. Someone was inside my house, and they were close enough that I could hear the audio from the phone call echoing in the hallway. I jumped off the bed and shoved the bedroom door open while holding the knife in front of me like a complete maniac. The hallway was empty. The weak hallway light flickered overhead exactly the way the man had described days earlier, and in the middle of the hallway near the wall, there was an old cell phone sitting on the floor with the screen lit up. My number was displayed on the active call. My entire body went into panic instantly. I immediately looked around expecting to see someone hiding there, but nobody was there. I ran into the living room and noticed something that made my stomach drop. The back door was slightly open a few inches. I was absolutely certain it had been locked. Cold wind drifted through the opening, making the kitchen curtain move slightly. At that exact moment, I heard running footsteps outside the house, not near the front. In the backyard near the empty lot behind the property, I ran to the door, but by the time I got there, all I could see was darkness and parts of the yard still damp from the rain earlier that week. Whoever had been there was already gone. I called the police immediately afterward. My voice sounded so bad the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat my address twice. While waiting for the officers to arrive, I sat on the couch holding the knife and staring at the back door. I could hear the wind moving through the backyard, and every tiny sound made my heart race again. The old cell phone stayed in the hallway with the call still active until it finally disconnected on its own. When the police arrived, they searched the entire house, the backyard, and part of the empty lot behind the property, but they found nobody. One officer picked up the phone left in the hallway while wearing gloves and asked if I recognized it. I had never seen it before. It was a cheap phone, one of those old prepaid models. No case, no photos, almost nothing saved on it. The officer tried checking information right there, but the device seemed completely wiped clean. The strangest part was that there were no contacts stored besides my recent number in the call history. They also found muddy footprints near the back door, as if someone had been standing there before running through the backyard. When I told them about the previous calls, one of the officers immediately asked whether anyone had access to the house. Landlord, maintenance workers, former tenants. And that was when I started remembering something that had seemed irrelevant until then. A few weeks before the call started, the landlord had sent a man to check a plumbing problem in the kitchen. I hadn't been home the entire time while he worked because I had to leave to handle something at the bank that day. I remembered it immediately because the officer specifically asked if anyone had recently been alone inside the house. The problem was that I barely remembered the guy's face. He was probably in his 40s, wearing a dark cap and a short beard. Nothing memorable. The police wrote everything down, but honestly, it seemed difficult to directly connect him to the calls. After the officers left, I simply couldn't stay in that house that night. I packed some clothes and went to sleep at my brother's house in West Des Moines. The strange thing was that the calls completely stopped after that night. No calls, no messages, nothing. That should have reassured me, but it actually did the opposite, because it felt like the person had gotten exactly what they wanted. Over the following days, I only returned to the house during daylight to collect more things, and I immediately started searching for somewhere else to live. And even weeks later, every time I entered that house alone, I felt that horrible sensation that someone knew every corner of it better than I did, especially the hallway. To this day, I still can't hear a phone ringing late at night without remembering that call echoing inside the house while I still believed the person was outside. I thought everything would end after I moved. About 2 weeks after that night, I managed to cancel the lease on the house because of safety concerns and moved into a small apartment closer to the city. The building had security, a gated parking garage, and much more activity around it. I needed that feeling of having people nearby because after what happened, silent houses started making me panic. During the first few days in the new apartment, I barely slept properly. Every sound in the hallway woke me up. I started checking the locks multiple times before bed and left the TV on, just to avoid complete silence. My brother said I was traumatized, and he was probably right. Even so, little by little, I started believing I was finally safe. After all, the police had my report. I had changed addresses and nobody called again. Until one night, almost a month after moving, my phone vibrated close to midnight while I was sitting in the living room assembling some new furniture. Unknown number again. My stomach instantly went cold just from seeing the screen. I stared at it ringing without answering. The call disconnected. 10 seconds later, it started again. On the third time, I answered almost automatically, more angry than anything else. As soon as I put the phone to my ear, I heard only silence. Then the same male voice calmly said, "This new television is smaller." At that moment, my entire body turned ice cold. I hung up immediately and started looking around the living room, trying to understand how that was possible. The curtains were closed. The apartment was on the 4th floor. There was no simple way for someone to see inside from outside. My heart started racing exactly like the first time back at the house. I ran to the apartment door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Even so, I kept listening carefully, waiting for footsteps or movement. Nothing, complete silence. I picked up the phone again and tried calling the number back, but it only showed unavailable caller. I spent the rest of the night practically sitting on the couch, unable to relax. And the worst part was that the more I thought about it, the more I realized something terrible. Maybe that person had never been interested specifically in the old house. Maybe they were interested in me. The next day, I requested a copy of the old police report and spoke again with the owner of the first house. That was when I learned something that made everything even worse. The man sent to repair the plumbing hadn't worked for the company for months. According to the landlord, he had been fired after incidents involving unauthorized entry into vacant properties the company managed. The police were never able to directly connect him to my calls because the phone left in the hallway was impossible to trace. But after learning that, I changed my number, deleted my social media, and spent a long time avoiding any predictable routine. To this day, I never received another call, but there's still one thing I can't forget. During that last call, before hanging up, I heard one very specific sound in the background, the metallic noise of my apartment building's elevator doors opening. Story 5. I was 27 years old at the time, and used to take short camping trips whenever I could get a few days off work. I lived in Wichita, Kansas, and my best friend back then, Derek, was practically as obsessed with camping as I was. We didn't do those super professional hikes or anything extreme, but we liked finding more isolated places where we could spend a night away from the city, cell phones, and noise. At the beginning of autumn, we decided to travel to a lesser-known area of the Mark Twain National Forest in southern Missouri. It wasn't exactly a famous or highly touristic park, Most people went to the more popular areas with infrastructure and organized campsites. We specifically wanted to avoid that. We found a location on an old hiking forum, where some people talked about an open area near a rarely used trail, far from the main parts of the park. It sounded perfect for spending a quiet night. We left early on a Friday and arrived in the region near the end of the afternoon. The weather was cold but still manageable. Gray skies, strong wind through the trees, and that constant smell of damp earth and dry leaves typical of forests during autumn. The last stretch to the trail was along a narrow gravel road that was practically empty. For almost 40 minutes, we didn't pass a single other car. No park ranger, no campers, nothing. The trail to the chosen spot was also much more isolated than we expected. We hiked for nearly an hour carrying equipment until we found the open area marked on the offline map we had downloaded before the trip. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall trees on all four sides. The ground was relatively clean, covered in dry leaves and firm enough dirt to pitch a tent without difficulty. Our first impression was great precisely because it looked like a place very few people used. There were no tables, prepared fire pits, or trash scattered around like normal campsites. Just nature and silence. While we were unloading our backpacks, Derek pointed out something strange near a tree at the edge of the clearing. There was a small red ribbon tied to a low branch. It didn't look new, but it also didn't look completely old. I figured it might have been some trail marking left by hunters or someone who had marked a path years earlier. We kept setting up the tent normally until we noticed another ribbon farther away. And then another. None of them were very visible at first glance. Small faded pieces of cloth tied to branches around the clearing. Blue, red, yellow. All at different heights. I joked that it looked like the setting of a bad horror movie. But honestly, it still didn't feel scary. Just strange. The problem was realizing the ribbons didn't follow any trail direction. They seemed specifically scattered around that open area. Even thinking it was weird, we kept setting up camp because it was already getting dark quickly. The temperature dropped a lot as soon as the sun disappeared behind the trees, and the wind started getting stronger inside the forest. We lit a small fire near the tent and started making food while there was still some light left in the sky. I remember feeling that initial calm that always comes after you finish setting everything up and finally sit down. The fire crackling, the smell of burning wood, the constant sound of wind moving through the tall trees. But there was one thing I slowly started noticing in that clearing. There were practically no animal sounds, no insects, no nocturnal birds, not even those normal noises of small animals moving through leaves in the woods. It was an extremely strange silence for such an isolated area. At one point, Derek commented on it while stirring the food. He said something like, "Man, have you noticed this forest feels dead?" And honestly, when he said that, I immediately realized I'd been thinking the exact same thing without wanting to admit it. The silence there didn't feel natural. It felt like a total absence of movement. And the later the night got, the more uncomfortable it became. After eating, we sat near the fire talking quietly, because the place automatically gave you the feeling that you shouldn't make too much noise. It's hard to explain to someone who's never camped in a truly isolated area. There are places where silence feels normal, and there are places where silence feels attentive. It was around 10 p.m. when we heard the first sound coming from the woods, a dry branch snapping, not near the tent, farther away on the opposite side of the clearing. We both automatically looked in that direction, expecting maybe to see a deer or another large animal, but nothing appeared. Derek grabbed the flashlight and shined it between the trees for a few seconds, but the beam only reached trunks and leaves moving in the wind. Then everything went silent again. We kept talking, trying to act normal, but both of us were clearly more alert afterward. About 15 minutes later, we heard another sound. This time closer. It sounded like someone walking slowly over dry leaves. 2 or 3 steps, then complete silence again. I grabbed my own flashlight and quickly lit up the edge of the clearing. Nothing, no reflected animal eyes, no visible movement. And the worst part was exactly that. The sounds always stopped right outside the range of the light, as if something was intentionally keeping its distance. From that moment on, the feeling of calm completely disappeared. We tried acting normal, but you could tell by the way we both talked less that the mood had changed. The fire started dying down, and the darkness around the clearing became much heavier. The flashlights illuminated only small pieces of the forest at a time, and everything else looked like black emptiness between the trees. Several times we heard those short footsteps on dry leaves again, never running, never coming directly toward us, always slow and spaced out, circling the clearing without actually entering it. Derek started rationalizing, saying it was probably some large animal following the smell of food. And honestly, I wanted to believe that. The problem was that the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. There wasn't that irregular pattern common with deer or raccoons moving through brush. They sounded like human footsteps trying to be careful. At one point, I spoke louder toward the forest and asked something like, "Is someone there?" Only the wind answered. No movement afterward for almost 5 full minutes. And right when we started relaxing a little, we heard another crack from the opposite side of the clearing, as if whatever it was had changed positions while we were looking ahead. Around midnight, we decided to partially put out the fire and get inside the tent, because the cold was becoming unbearable. The tent was made for 2 people and relatively small, so every movement or sound outside seemed even closer. I remember lying there listening to the wind hitting the fabric while Derek messed with his phone trying to get signal, even though we knew there wasn't any. The problem was that without the sound of the fire burning, the noises from the forest became much clearer. About 20 minutes after we got inside, we heard footsteps again. This time definitely close to the tent. Not close enough to step on the tarp, but close enough that we could hear leaves slowly being compressed around the clearing. We both stayed completely motionless listening. The sound stopped, then started again from another point, as if someone was walking in slow circles around the campsite. I grabbed the flashlight and quickly shined it through the tent opening. Nothing. Just trees, darkness, and the remains of the dying fire releasing faint smoke. The silence returned again. Then we heard something different. A small metallic click coming from the woods, very short, like someone adjusting equipment or accidentally hitting metal against something. Derek looked at me immediately, and by his expression I realized we were finally both thinking the exact same thing. That probably wasn't an animal at all. After that metallic sound, neither of us could relax inside the tent anymore. We listened carefully to every noise outside while the wind kept shaking the trees above the clearing. At some moments it sounded like there was more than one person out there because the noises came from different sides of the tent, within very short intervals, but it was hard to be certain. Fear starts distorting your perception when you're in a completely dark place with no reference points around you. Derek suggested maybe it was hunters or people walking through the woods at night, but that didn't make sense either. Who walks that silently in the middle of nowhere near a campsite without calling out or using lights? At one point, we clearly heard leaves being stepped on very close to the entrance of the tent, close enough that I could tell exactly which side the sound came from. My whole body locked up instantly. I held the flashlight aimed at the opening, expecting to see a shadow or someone moving outside. The sound stopped completely. We stayed in absolute silence for several seconds, and then we heard slow breathing. Not loud, just someone breathing quietly very close to the tent. Derek immediately grabbed his camping knife while I partially unzipped the entrance and pointed the flashlight outside. Nobody was there. The beam swept across the entire clearing quickly. Trees, backpacks, fallen logs, smoke from the dying fire. Nothing else. The problem was the overwhelming feeling that something had just moved away seconds before the light appeared. Derek and I stepped out of the tent together, trying to act braver than we actually felt. The cold was much worse now, and the humidity made the air feel heavy to breathe. We slowly walked around the campsite, shining the lights between the trees. That's when we noticed something else strange. There were more ribbons tied to branches than before. I can't explain how we realized it so quickly, but it suddenly felt obvious. Small pieces of cloth appeared in places where I was certain they hadn't been while we set up the tent. One was tied to a very low branch near our backpacks. Another appeared behind a tree exactly in the direction where we had heard the footsteps minutes earlier. Derek started getting genuinely nervous then. He kept repeating that maybe we were too tired or seeing things that weren't really there. But while we walked around the clearing, we found something that completely destroyed any attempt at rationalizing. Footprints, fresh ones, clearly human, pressed into the damp dirt between dry leaves only a few yards from the tent, and they didn't come from any trail. They emerged from the woods and disappeared back into the dark trees again. At that point, we were both truly scared. It wasn't just light camping tension anymore. Someone was walking around the clearing during the night, and that person was clearly staying close enough to observe the tent without being seen. Derek wanted to leave immediately, but the problem was that taking everything down in the dark in the middle of the forest felt even worse. The trail back to the truck was long, full of rocks, roots, and narrow sections. If someone really was hidden in the woods, we'd be extremely vulnerable walking through there without enough light. So we decided to do what seemed least risky at the time: rebuild the fire, stay awake, and wait for sunrise. We quickly gathered more firewood while constantly shining our flashlights around the clearing. The fire grew stronger again and brought a small feeling of safety, but not enough, because the noises continued coming from the woods, farther away now but still there. Sometimes a branch snapped. Sometimes dry leaves shifted slowly, and every time we pointed the flashlight toward the sound, everything stopped immediately. At one point, I had the distinct impression of seeing a silhouette between two distant trees. Something tall standing still, partially hidden behind a trunk. When I shined the flashlight more directly, there was nothing there besides darkness and branches moving in the wind. Even so, my heart took several minutes to calm down afterward. The rest of the night basically turned into a silent wait for daylight. Derek and I barely spoke anymore. We sat near the fire listening to the forest and constantly scanning the clearing. The cold became so intense that my fingers started going numb even close to the flames. Sometimes the noises disappeared completely for 15 or 20 minutes. And right when we started relaxing again, they returned from another section of the woods, always circling, never fully approaching. Shortly before dawn, I think I briefly fell asleep sitting up, because I remember waking suddenly when Derek quietly called my name. The sky was beginning to brighten slightly between the trees, and we could finally see the area around us better. Derek was standing near the tent staring at the ground with a strange look on his face. I immediately got up thinking he had found more footprints. But it was worse. The colored ribbons now clearly formed a circle around our campsite. Small pieces of cloth tied to low branches surrounding the entire clearing at nearly equal distances from each other, and I was absolutely certain it hadn't looked like that the night before. Some ribbons were so close to the tent that it would have been impossible not to notice them while setting up camp. We both stared at them silently for several seconds because your brain needs time to accept certain things when you're still trying to find a rational explanation. I slowly walked around the tent, examining the ribbons more closely. Some looked old and faded, but others were much cleaner, almost new, and now it was obvious they weren't randomly scattered through the forest. They formed an almost perfect circle around the exact place where we had pitched the tent. The precise center was where we had slept. My stomach dropped immediately because it meant someone had already marked that place before we arrived. Derek immediately started packing our things without saying much. I think we had both reached the same conclusion and neither of us wanted to say it out loud. While we dismantled the camp, I began noticing more strange signs around the clearing that we hadn't seen in the dark. Small pieces of string tied to high branches, old knife marks carved into some trees, and worst of all, old fire pits scattered around different points of the clearing, as if that place had been used many times before. Not by normal campers. It felt organized in some strange way I couldn't explain. We packed everything extremely quickly and started hiking back toward the trail without stopping to rest. The morning light should have made things feel safer, but honestly, I felt even worse now that I could properly see the forest around us, because now it was obvious how isolated that area truly was. No distant road sounds, no other tents, no signs of normal people, just trees and miles of dense woods. Several times I had the feeling we were still being watched while leaving. I didn't hear footsteps this time, but there was still that constant impression of movement between the trees whenever I glanced sideways. The trail felt much longer on the way back. When we finally reached the improvised parking area near the gravel road, I felt such intense relief that my legs almost felt light. But that relief lasted only a few seconds, because tied to Derek's driver's side mirror was a red ribbon. Neither of us had put it there. And I am absolutely certain it hadn't been on the truck when we arrived the previous afternoon. Derek ripped the ribbon off immediately and threw it on the ground without saying a word. We got into the truck and left right away. For almost half an hour, neither of us spoke. The sound of gravel hitting under the truck and the engine filled the silence inside the cab. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting another vehicle to appear behind us on that empty road. Derek drove much faster than usual, gripping the steering wheel tightly the entire time. At one point, he finally spoke. He said he didn't want to sound paranoid, but he had the feeling he heard people walking near the tent long before waking me during the night. According to him, at one point while I was nearly asleep, he clearly heard two different sets of footsteps circling the clearing from opposite sides. That sent a chill through me instantly, because it confirmed the exact impression I had also felt several times during the night. I asked why he hadn't said anything sooner. He answered that he thought maybe he was too tired or too scared to trust his own hearing. Honestly, I understood perfectly because I had been doing the exact same thing to myself since the beginning. When we finally reached a larger road near a small town, we stopped at a gas station to get coffee and try processing everything. And that's where the conversation happened that still disturbs me the most. While we were drinking coffee inside the convenience store, Derek casually mentioned the area where we had camped to an older employee. The man immediately asked which trail we used. As soon as we roughly described the location of the clearing, his expression changed completely. He stayed silent for a few seconds before asking if we had seen the markings on the trees. My whole body went cold instantly. I asked what he meant. The man answered that local hunters had avoided that specific area for years because they found strange signs in the woods during autumn. According to him, some people believed groups entered the area during certain times of year to hold illegal gatherings far from the main trails. When Derek mentioned the ribbons forming a circle, the man looked visibly uncomfortable and simply replied, "Then you guys camped in exactly the wrong place." I asked what that meant, but he refused to explain much more. He only said we were lucky to leave before another night fell. And honestly, the way he said that disturbed me far more than anything supernatural ever could have, because it sounded like real knowledge, the kind of knowledge locals have when they know exactly what kind of people wander through those woods at night. Story 6. I was 26 at the time and traveling alone by car through California after visiting a friend in Sacramento. My plan was to drive down to San Diego over a few days, stopping in smaller cities along the way to save money. I was working remotely at the time, so I could organize the trip while still answering some work messages at night. Since I was trying to spend as little as possible, I started looking for cheap rooms in online listings instead of hotels. In Fresno, I found a listing that seemed perfect. It was a simple room in a shared house for a price far below the hotels in the area. The host was named Daniel and had a few short positive reviews saying the place was clean and quiet. Nothing about the profile seemed strange. The photos showed a small but organized room with a double bed, a desk, and a shared bathroom in the hallway. I booked it for just one night because I planned to continue driving early the next morning. Throughout the conversation, the host was polite but replied very briefly. Late in the afternoon, he messaged saying he had to leave because of a family emergency and probably wouldn't be there when I arrived. But he left detailed instructions for entering the house using a lockbox attached near the front door. That didn't seem strange to me because a lot of people do that with short-term rentals. I arrived at the house around 8 p.m. The neighborhood was residential and relatively quiet, one of those places where almost every house looks the same. Wide streets, very few people walking around, and weak street lighting. The house itself was single-story, old, and slightly more neglected than it looked in the photos. The front grass was overgrown, and there was an old pickup truck parked in the side driveway, partially covered with a tarp. Even so, nothing felt scary yet. I got the key from the lockbox exactly where the host had said it would be and went inside. The first thing I noticed was a strong smell of cleaning products mixed with old cigarette smoke. The house was completely silent. No TV on, no conversations, no sounds coming from the other rooms, just that muffled silence typical of a closed-up house. There was a narrow hallway right after the entrance with 3 doors. The host had explained through messages that my room would be the last one on the left. As soon as I entered, I immediately felt like something was strange, even though I couldn't explain exactly what. The room was tidy, but it didn't have that impersonal look common in rental spaces. There were small details that made it feel like someone actually lived there. A charger forgotten near the bed, a used plastic cup in the trash, a men's shirt hanging behind the door. At the time, I thought maybe the host had forgotten some things there before leaving in a hurry. It still seemed plausible, at least at that moment. Even thinking it was strange that the room looked used, I was too tired from driving to look for another place that late at night. So I just left my backpack near the bed, took a quick shower, and started replying to some work messages on my laptop. The house remained silent at an uncomfortable level. Several times I stopped typing just to listen more carefully to the environment, because I had this constant feeling that there should be some kind of sound coming from the house. A refrigerator, television, footsteps, anything. But there was nothing. The hallway seemed completely empty. At one point, I even messaged the host asking if there was anyone else staying in the house that night. He took a long time to reply and then wrote only, "I don't think so." The words "I don't think so" immediately bothered me. I replied asking what that meant, but he never opened the message after that. I remember automatically looking toward the bedroom door right then. I had locked it as soon as I entered, but suddenly that didn't feel sufficient anymore. While getting ready for bed, I started noticing other strange details in the room. There were fresh marks on the carpet near the bed, like furniture had recently been dragged around. I also found a crumpled receipt near the trash can with a timestamp from that same afternoon. That only reinforced the feeling that someone had left the room shortly before I arrived. Around midnight, I turned off the lights and tried to sleep. The problem was that the house made a lot of small noises: wood creaking, wind brushing against something outside, pipes vibrating sometimes, and when you're already uncomfortable, every sound starts seeming bigger than it really is. I think I spent almost an hour tossing in bed staring at the ceiling before finally starting to drift off. That's when I heard the first sound in the hallway. One slow footstep, then another. My whole body woke up instantly. I stayed still, trying to listen better, while the hallway returned to complete silence. I thought maybe it was another guest going to the bathroom, which would be normal in a shared house. But then I heard it again. Very slow footsteps passing through the hallway. Not quick like someone walking normally through a house. They sounded careful. At one point, the footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom door. I felt my heart speed up immediately. I waited to hear the person continue walking or enter another room, but nothing happened. The silence became so heavy that I started hearing my own breathing too loudly inside the dark room. And then the doorknob slowly turned, very slowly, like someone trying to open the door without making noise. At that moment, my whole body froze. I stayed completely still in bed, staring at the door while the knob moved slowly twice in a row. Not forcefully. It didn't sound like someone confused trying to find the right room. It sounded like someone carefully testing whether the door was locked. After a few seconds, everything became silent again. My heart was beating so hard that I started feeling that strange pressure in my ears. I slowly picked up my phone, trying not to make any noise, and immediately messaged the host asking if there was another person in the house. No response. I waited several minutes staring at the door in the dark, trying to convince myself maybe it was just another guest trying to open the wrong room. But then I heard the footsteps again in the hallway, closer this time, slowly pacing back and forth in front of the door. At one point, I heard a small metallic sound like keys touching each other. That's when I started genuinely panicking. I quietly grabbed my backpack and placed it near the bed, already thinking about leaving if it continued. Then the doorknob moved again, this time more firmly, and along with it I clearly heard the sound of a key being inserted into the lock from outside the door. I remember exactly how that felt physically. My stomach completely dropped, because it meant someone besides me had access to that room. I automatically held my breath while listening to the key partially turn in the lock. The door jerked slightly but didn't fully open because I had also locked the simple interior latch on the door. There was silence outside for a few seconds. Then I heard a low sigh, and finally footsteps slowly walking away down the hallway. I stayed sitting on the bed without moving for a very long time because honestly, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call the police immediately. Another part still tried to believe there could be some normal explanation. Maybe the host had accidentally rented the same room to another person. Maybe it was someone drunk trying to enter the wrong room. The problem was that none of those possibilities explained the careful way that person tried to open the door. After several minutes, I gathered the courage to get up and slowly approach. I crouched near the door and looked through the small gap between it and the floor, trying to see movement in the hallway. I saw nothing. Then I slowly stood up and looked through the narrow crack near the lock. That's when I saw a man standing outside staring directly at my bedroom door, while holding a key identical to mine in his hand. The moment I saw the man through the crack, my whole body went ice cold. He didn't look startled to be there, or confused. In fact, what disturbed me the most was exactly how calm he looked. He was probably around 40 years old with short dark hair and a heavy jacket, even though it wasn't that cold that night. He held the key while staring at the door as if waiting for some movement from me inside. I stayed completely motionless, even trying to control my breathing, because I was afraid he would realize I was watching him. After a few seconds, he slightly tilted his head, like someone listening carefully through the wood. My heart was pounding so hard I honestly thought he might hear it. Then he did something that terrified me even more. He tried the key again, very slowly. The knob partially turned until the interior latch stopped the door from opening. There was another long silence. Then I heard his low voice outside the door almost whisper, "I thought this room was empty." I automatically stepped backward, holding my phone so tightly that my hand started hurting. I didn't answer. I just waited for any reaction from the other side of the door. After a few seconds, I heard his footsteps slowly moving away down the hallway until they disappeared. I spent the rest of that night barely able to breathe normally. I shoved the desk against the door together with the chair and sat on the bed holding my phone ready to call the police if I heard any sound again. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Then I started hearing faint movement in another part of the house. Doors opening and closing softly, footsteps crossing the hallway. At some moments, it sounded like there was more than one person inside. The problem was not knowing whether I was really hearing those sounds or if my brain was already turning every noise into a threat. I tried calling the host 3 more times. No answer. At one point, I even thought about simply running out of the house and sleeping in my car until morning. But the idea of opening that door and finding someone in the hallway seemed worse, so I stayed there waiting for daylight. I think around 5 in the morning I briefly fell asleep sitting on the bed, because I woke up startled by light coming through the gaps in the curtains. The house was completely silent again. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. I waited a while longer before moving the desk away from the door. My hands were shaking while I unlocked the room. The hallway looked empty, but there was something on the floor directly in front of the door. A second key identical to mine. At that moment, my stomach completely turned. I stared at the key on the floor for several seconds without having the courage to touch it, because that destroyed any attempt to believe the man had simply confused the room. He clearly knew I was inside, and someone had left that second key directly in front of the door while I was locked in the room. I grabbed my things as quickly as possible without even changing clothes properly. The house remained far too silent. I walked through the hallway, glancing quickly toward the other rooms while heading for the exit. One of the doors was slightly open, but I couldn't see anything inside besides darkness. The strong smell of cigarettes seemed even stronger that morning. The moment I stepped outside the house, I felt immediate relief just from breathing normal air again. I got into my car and locked the doors instantly. Before starting the engine, I finally decided to properly research the listing because until then I had only used the original link sent to me. That's when everything started getting much worse. I found the exact same house listed under at least 3 different profiles on different websites. Same photos, same room, but different host names. My heart started beating so hard I felt dizzy sitting inside the car. I kept searching and noticed another disturbing detail. On one of the listings, the room was shown as available for that exact same night I had stayed there, meaning theoretically another person could have booked the same place at the same time as me. On another profile, there was a short review from a woman saying she left during the night because someone tried to enter the wrong room. The comment disappeared minutes later when I refreshed the page. At that point, I finally called the police because I started realizing it probably wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. While waiting on the phone, I automatically looked in the rearview mirror toward the front of the house, and I swear I saw the curtain in one of the windows move slightly, like someone was watching from inside. I left that street immediately and drove straight to a busy coffee shop near the main road before waiting for the police to return my call. Later, the officers told me they had already received similar complaints involving fake listings in shared houses in that area, but it was difficult to prove anything because the profiles disappeared too quickly. I never found out who the man in the hallway was, or whether he had actually rented that room too or was part of the scheme. But to this day, I still think about one specific thing from that night. If I hadn't used the interior latch on the door, that key would have opened it normally. After speaking with the police, they asked me to send screenshots of the listings and the messages exchanged with the supposed host. The problem was that when I tried opening the original profile again, it had completely disappeared. It wasn't just the listing taken down, the entire user seemed deleted. That made me even more nervous because it showed how quickly they erased any trace. The officers basically said it was probably some kind of scam involving double booking cheap rooms. But honestly, that didn't explain the behavior of the man in the hallway. If it were only about money, why try opening the door in the middle of the night like that? And why leave another key outside the room? In the following days, I became obsessed with trying to understand what had really happened in that house. I reviewed all the messages, timestamps, and listing details. That's when I noticed something strange. The host never directly answered any specific questions about who lived there. He always avoided them or replied vaguely. And something else started bothering me afterward. In the listing photos, the men's shirt hanging behind the door wasn't there. Neither was the charger, nor the cup in the trash. That meant someone had probably used that room shortly before I arrived. A few weeks later, I told the whole story to a friend of mine who worked for a temporary rental platform support company. She decided to investigate more deeply, using some internal tools she had access to. According to her, there had been several listings connected to the same address over previous months, always with different host names and slightly altered photos. Some stayed active only for a few days before disappearing. Others received strange reviews mentioning safety problems, unexpected guests, or room confusion. The most disturbing part was when she mentioned that some listings showed simultaneous availability for the same room during overlapping times, meaning more than one person really could be sent to the same house on the same night. To this day, I still don't know exactly what the purpose of that was. Maybe robbery, maybe something worse. Maybe they simply counted on frightened guests leaving without reporting anything. But there's one part of the story I've never truly forgotten. When I was leaving that morning, before getting into the car, I glanced quickly toward the side window of the house, and for a second, I clearly saw the same man standing behind the curtain staring out toward the street, except this time he wasn't alone. There was another silhouette standing behind him in the dark hallway of the house.
I'm really grateful for staying until the last minute. It's always good to know that you're here, listening to every detail. If you liked it, comment which part was the scariest for you. And of course, sign up to keep listening to stories as dark as this one. See you in the next video.